I don't know, Mike. You're like white and cis and shit, right?
Last time I checked.
Yeah. So like, as weird as it sounds to say, right? Like, you're not wealthy, so like, we could still be on the same side. But like, you're coming from like a wholly different like perspective than I am. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
you actually don't have too much of a vested interest, um, in a purely like selfish sense. You don't have much vested interest in like how like okay, like the recent like storm of like anti-trans laws and shits. Like they don't affect you a ton personally. Like you would agree with that or no?
Um,
From a
I
purely
mean,
self like
me
devoid of
personally,
altruism,
no,
yeah.
but
That's what I mean. Like and it's really weird to be like on the same side as people like that. Does that make sense? So like we both want generally the same things from like our government and shit. You would agree, Mike?
yeah.
Okay. But like I'm trying to get you to understand my perspective. From my perspective, right? Like so because of that and because I am a minority group, right? Like I just am. I'm coming from a different like area from it. You're part of like the larger group, right? The significantly larger group. You know what I mean? And it feels weird like allying with people who have like a much, I guess you'd say, larger fighting force in the fight for rights and shit like that. Does that make sense? Because it means that like if I just kept to my group and like quote unquote my people and the groups I'm a part of, I like instantly lose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we gotta have fucking solidarity.
Yeah, and coalition building, but that's the whole point. Like I'm uncomfortable. Like solidarity makes me feel weird. Does that make sense?
Okay, in what way?
It makes me feel like weak, I guess. You
I
get what I'm
mean,
saying? Like you get what you know what I'm
sure.
getting at, right? Like
Yeah.
because I require solidarity, but you don't necessarily. And
I
because of
mean,
that, you like cis white fucking people have to be like the or cis het people, I should say, have to be like the engine from which I acquire my own freedom, and I don't like that. Does that make sense?
sure, I get what you mean by that, and well, granted, I guess I can't necessarily speak to whatever sort of hmm.
Because like the recent, what do you think about that? Like the recent like events regarding like the waves of legislations and like being called groomers and pedophiles, like real like old like anti-queer sentiments, like just straight up like demonizing, not even just like oh they're bad people, like no, it's gotten to the point where there's like we're like openly being called like pedophiles and groomers and shit, right? Like real like old school shit is coming back in a big way, and like needing a coalition to stop that, and that coalition being in almost like being the majority comprised of people just because of sheer numbers, right? Being majority comprised of people who aren't a part of the attacked group means that like I have to expect all the people who aren't part of the attacked group to go above and beyond in the sake of people who aren't from the same group. Does that make sense? And I'm really uncomfortable with that because it means that like there's significantly less incentive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I also disagree because to the extent that like even if that the larger group isn't necessarily being targeted in such the same
I understand.
degree or
Sorry.
for the same reasons that a more marginalized group would be, there will be some other reason.
Yes, my point is not that because the people in the coalition, so to speak, are not being actively targeted right now. It doesn't mean that they don't have like a reason to be invested in the future. of their own, like, even if it's just self-preservation, right? My point is that, like, because it's not right now, the incentive and pressingness is lost to the people who aren't part of the currently targeted group. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
And because of that, like, I expect so much less. Like, there's a thing, like, in the community where it's like the silence of cis people is deafening. Because, like, it really is. Like, when we say cis people, we don't mean just like that's not like to say like, oh, people who aren't on our side or like libs and shit. No, like just cis people in general. Like there is a remarkable amount of people who are cis who just refuse to attempt to understand or like defend the trans community in any meaningful way. If that makes any sense. Like, trans rights, right? Like people say that shit, but like what have they done? You know what I mean? And I'm not saying everyone has to have action. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to like march or go on your way to help actively. Like you don't have to go like provide food for like the marches and stuff. Like you don't have to do all that. What I'm saying is like when I say like what action have they taken? Like I don't see a lot of like cis people, especially cis het people. Because they're doubly like alienated from most trans people because they have no queer identity. um like I can't tell you for a fact that they don't like read or understand trans people in any meaningful way, but it feels like there is no real discourse about it. Does that make sense? Like, and I don't mean like, oh, should trans people be a thing? That's not what I'm saying. Like that's obviously wrong. I'm saying that like people will see like shit like Joe Rogan saying like, yeah, we should not allow like kids to have hormone blockers. And a lot of cis people, especially cis het people, will just be like, that seems reasonable to me, right? Like the way they'll listen to what like fucking Joe Rogan says or some other person who has like an extremely uneducated opinion, and they'll just be like, that opinion sounds reasonable to me. And since they don't have the investiture to like try to fix that opinion, what they'll do is they'll just sort of like think about it for a second, decide that like it's really a personal thing, and then move on without actually ever understanding like the trans side of the issue, which is the correct side. Like the only people who it matters to, which is trans people. That's the only people who should be like concerned about it are trans people. And by that I mean like if you're cis, let trans people do whatever they want. You know what I mean? Like if a kid thinks they might be trans, they can do whatever the fuck they want. Like that's bodily autonomy. That's how that works. But like when it comes to like needing their support, like cis people's support to make sure that these fucking bills don't pass because there's just not that many trans people comparatively, right? I don't like the fact that they have to do all that work, or at least that I know that they don't do that work to try to educate themselves. Does that make sense? Like I spend all my time reading about like, oh, the trans existence, like how trans people like aren't allowed the closet. You know what I mean? Like, okay, here's a good example, Mike. And be honest with me and tell me if you've thought about this before. You ready?
Okay.
Okay. I don't remember. I'm so sorry to whatever SES wrote this. I'm sorry. I should give you credit. I just don't remember. I'm sorry. If I find it, I'll link it in the description. So, when you meet a gay person and they say, "Oh, I'm gay, but I was closeted," right? What does that mean to you? I don't mean like you personally. I mean like what can you interpret about that person? Like on the most basic level.
Uh, well, that they had clearly had to keep who they truly are hidden for one reason or another, but at least if they're telling me now, they either feel comfortable enough with me to tell me that or are out of the closet currently.
Yeah, and to add on, and that's a good answer. And to add on to that, on top of the fact that they are out of the closet, it doesn't mean that they weren't gay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If they were just hiding it, even if it was from themselves and they were denying it. Now, Michael, if somebody told you, "Yeah, I'm trans," and in high school I was like male presenting or whatever, what does that mean to you? And you're probably already thinking exactly what my point is, right? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes.
What would that be, Mike? I just want to make sure we're on the same page here.
Uh, well, at least I think I get what you're
I
getting
want to
at.
hear what your thoughts are. I don't. I'm not trying to get.
Yeah,
You're not trying to give me what I want to hear.
that it's not like suddenly you are one gender and then you're another. You were always this particular whatever whichever gender you feel that you are, whether you realize it or not. But because of whatever sort of societal pressures you are under, you had to, you know, present yourself as whatever the quote unquote uh
Normative position is what we're
yeah
looking for.
normative position is.
Yeah, that's the point. But be honest with me, Mike. Have you ever thought about that before? About trans people? Because you're probably also thinking what that would lead to is that a lot of trans people don't get that, oh, you're trans now. What they'll say is they'll say, you're trans now, or they'll say, like, oh, so you were a man or you were a woman. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That's like saying, oh, gay person, back when you were straight. Does that make sense? Like, honestly, have you ever thought about that? Like
um,
that issue, the disconnect between those two like worlds of
sure, yeah,
understanding. Have you ever
it
thought
has
about
occurred to
that?
me. Yes.
See, now I almost guarantee you almost no one has. That's my point. Like people will say, "Oh, that's how you are now. You just decided one day that that's what you're gonna do." Does that make sense? It's like not getting the closet is another way that like trans people like are discriminated against even amongst like queer folk who don't understand it. Does that make sense? And that's my point is that like I'm reliant on like a lot of people who don't understand how that works on like any real intimate level. But on top of that, they also don't want to educate themselves. And because of that ignorance, are willing to listen to people who spread misinformation or just like actively like hate. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
And I'm just not comfortable with that. Like having to rely on people. That's what I'm talking about like with coalition building. Like it's really important. But damn does it make me uncomfortable like having to fucking listen to all these people. I don't know, being trans is fucking annoying. Like it's great, don't get me wrong, but like god damn is it like one of the worst things to be right now. Like just in general, it just fucking sucks. Especially if you like intersect even harder. Like if you're trans, gay, and you're POC, like oh fuck me, like I'm so sorry. Like not because of those intersections. I'm sorry that you're having to deal with all the shit you're having to deal with. 'Cause, like even drag queens are really getting it right now. Like gender non-conforming people right now are just or even people who just like buck gender norms. Like even if it's like you know, as a special event like for like drag queens and shit. You know what I mean? Like they're like we're getting it real hard right now. And it's just like real shit, to be honest. That's like my main issue right now is I don't know. It just feels really fucking bad to have to like rely on all these fucking people to like do the work that I need done for me when they don't have the incentive to really like you know defend themselves. Because I don't know if you know this, Mike, but even amongst queer people, like most like there's still huge hangups about like dating trans people at all, and then like that's if they can have sex with trans people. Does that make sense? Like even amongst queer people, that's like a problem.
Sure.
Like trans people basically like it's like extremely hard for trans people to date non-trans people because of all the hangups. It's that intense. Like even amongst queer people who should understand. You know what I mean? And I don't know. It's like it's the fucking worst. I've been talking a lot, Mike. You have anything to add right now? Don't worry, you're not like talking
Um.
over me or anything. If you haven't a, well, I know you're like a nice guy, Mike. So I don't want you to think that like
Oh, jeez.
you
Why'd you
have
call
to.
me that?
No, you are, Mike. You understand people. You have an altruistic spirit about you. What I'm saying is like you don't have to feel like if you have a strong opinion or you have an opinion like if you want to be like feel free to like say whatever you want without like a fear of ignorance like stopping you from saying it or that like you might be talking over like even if you disagree with me, you know what I mean? That's another thing
Yeah.
is like people are afraid to fucking disagree with me.
No, it's more just that like I don't. I don't really necessarily have anything to add that somebody hasn't already said, probably in a better way than I have.
Well, the thing is, Mike, and this is another thing. I have trouble with that same issue where I just don't say things because like in my mind other people have heard it better elsewhere. But my whole thing is that if you hear a good argument, just fucking steal it. Like if there's something you want to say, like say it. Because let's say that that person who said that good thing, what if they're never found by the person who's listening to this right now? They would lose out on that insight that you could have provided, even if you're just parroting somebody else's points. Like, for example, a great example of that, Mike, who the fuck is Red Foucault? Like, who do you know that has Red Foucault? Like, legitimately, who? Not my ass.
Well, granted, I haven't asked, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
not my ass. But I know about, like, the Panopticon and shit. You know what I mean? You see what I mean? So, like, if you have something to say, go ahead and say it.
Um, yeah, it's just like I get the sort of the feeling of kind of impotence in terms of having to rely on the uh, the generosity and yeah, sort of selflessness of others uh, when
See,
everything.
I'm going to correct your language a little bit. It's not generosity, it would be charity, would be a better word there. Because, like, it's not generous to give your time to, like, you know what I mean? Like that's it's soft language that I don't like. I don't think is correct. I'm sorry. Keep going.
Where the fuck was I? I don't know. Solidarity. That's really just what I want to get at. Just like yeah, it sucks feeling that you have no power in this world, but you know, apes together strong.
It's not even that. That's the whole point. It's like apes together strong, but like I'm out here hanging out with like not apes. You know what I mean? I'm just part of the ape coalition. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's really a solution for that necessarily.
There's not. I had to talk about it because it's just and I don't think a lot of people think about it. Like it's one thing that's like I'm not sure if you think about it that much, but like you got to understand that like when it's about like for a lot of like cishet people, leftism is about money and material conditions, right? And that's what a lot of like major leftist points of view revolve entirely around. That's why a lot of the leftist memes are about Marx and not about Foucault. You see what I mean? Like cishet, especially like white guys, don't feel the panopticon as much, anywhere near as much. You know what I mean? Like they don't feel the gaze of society sitting on them at all times. So that's why the majority of like leftist content, especially on the internet, is engaging with leftist principles from like a Marxist or like material standpoint. And a lot of like the deeper like meaning to stuff and like how everything intersects and like there's a lot of like especially like cishet white male leftists on the internet like don't understand anything beyond like the really simple take of like rich people have a lot of money and everyone should have like a good amount of money. You know what I mean? Like there's no reason for people to die when we have like all these material things, right? Like that's like where a lot of leftists come from. Like that's one of the things that like makes me really really like happy to see is that like do you know who Mildred is on you?
Yeah,
Are you on you?
Foxline.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So you know Mildred and you know Sophie,
Uh, from Mars.
the one from the planet Mars, yes.
Yes.
And then there's like contrapoints and shit like you know, like you get what I'm saying, right? Like how many people like know about Mildred and Sophie compared to people like Harris Bomber guy and people like Hassan and shit. You see my point?
Okay.
People who engage, granted Harris Bomber guy is more like a leftist person who makes good content. Does that make sense? And they fight against like misinformation. You know what I mean? Like that's why like their measured response series and shit, or his whatever, um, like measured response series is so popular. You know what I mean? But then you compare that to shit like Thought Slime's videos and like shit like that, and like the difference in popularity between like those people and then like Hassan Piker like makes me sad. You know what I mean? Because it means that like even amongst like my own people and like the coalition, I'm still like an outsider. Does that make sense? So like if you're wondering why like trans and queer communities get really fucking insular, this is kind of the reason. And don't get me wrong, I know a fuck ton of like really good allies. Like I know personally not a ton of trans people. Um Off the top of my head, one that like I speak to regularly. Now there's like a discourse to be had of whether or not like non-binary people are trans, and I do believe they are. Um, you know what I mean? But like I'm just not going to include the non-binary folk I know just because it's like a hot topic for some people. You know what I mean? But like yeah, I don't know. It's hard to get to the point that like there's an extra level of isolation that happens because your own sort of like people and the people that you rely on to sort of help you get through these things are coming at that fight without even a consideration for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of like Black Lives Matter solidarity from white people. Like a lot of it, like you'll see a lot of like I'm trying to make sure I don't paint with too wide of a brush because it's like really unfair, right? But like you'll see a lot of performative solidarity, right? Just for the sake of it. And I don't mean like corporate solidarity. Like of course they don't fucking care, right? I mean like from individual people who just like they don't put in an effort. Does that make sense? As much as they would if they were personally being attacked. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
I don't know. I feel like I'm just saying the same thing over and over again, but I think it's worth repeating that when you're like gender nonconforming or you're trans or just anything like that, there's such a fucking brutal sense of like detachment from the people around you that like the only place you feel like safe is either amongst only people who feel that same detachment or by yourself. Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah, that makes sense.
It just there's just such a rash of things, and like I can barely go on the like Twitter and shit. I try not to interact with stuff that makes me mad on Twitter, specifically because then it'll feed me more of that shit, right? But damn, is it really hard going on Twitter and like being afraid to go to pride events and shit because you'll be shot? Like I know one of the communities I'm in, one of the people was really talking about like, is it wrong to feel afraid to go to a pride event because there's a bunch of counter protesters having a Second Amendment like rally on the same day in an adjacent venue. You know what I mean? Like that's like really different. That's one of the things that like for example, we were talking about like Channel 5 and shit. That's one thing that like really annoys me about just like leftism in general is especially online like a lot of the cis het white males are the ones who have almost all of the power even amongst a group of people who should at least if they know what they're talking about have an understanding that that's how it is elsewhere and that can lead to like a really myopic view of like social justice as well as like economic equality. And I don't know, it hits real different when you're just trying to like enjoy like being queer and shit and like living your life, but like there's so few signs that you even exist outside of your own existence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's why I really appreciate people like Sophie and Mildred. Like seeing Mildred makes me happy. Just like just well, you know what I mean? Like damn, this sounds really sad. I don't mean to like depress everybody, but like seeing like Mildred and like Sophie and shit doing good like makes me happy cuz like who else is there really? Like there's ContraPoints, Mildred and Sophie. Fuck me. Oh, I'm such a fucking shithead. Abigail. Abigail Thorne from Philosophy Tube. I'm such a shithead. And then there's James Stephanie Sterling. I don't think who else there is. Like there's just not a lot comparatively. And it just sucks. Cuz like here's a great way to explain it actually. You know when you hear that thing where it's like, "Oh, you like Green Day, name 5 of their songs or whatever," right? Like that meme. Like you're a fan
Is
of
that a
blank,
meme?
name blank of their blank. You know what I'm talking about?
Okay.
You know what I'm talking about though, right? Well,
Yeah,
like
like vaguely. I don't know.
okay, so like it's like, "Oh, you're a fan of Morbius, name 3 of the characters in it." You know what I mean? Shit like that, right?
Yeah.
Well, so like when you're queer in leftist spaces, unironically that. Does that make sense? Like that's a great way to explain it, I think. Like, okay, if you went up to somebody that's like, "Oh, so you support trans rights?" Name 2 of the issues that are really important to trans people that are like primarily an issue for them. You know what I mean? Like name ways that you understand that they're oppressed. Does that make sense? And I'm not saying in particular, like it's just as fucking silly to say like, "Oh, if you don't understand how trans people are oppressed, then you can't possibly support them." But there is merit to it, isn't there? You know what I mean? Like there's merit to not understanding the people you claim to want to help in a meaningful way.
I mean, I would say that yeah, it certainly helps, but I mean, I think that the point has been made that you don't necessarily even have to understand queer or trans people to understand that like the 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 rhetoric being used against them is fucked up and that they deserve better and equal to everyone else.
Yes, but how many people understand trans issues in the same way that they would understand Marxist principles and like a materialistic or materialist viewpoint of the world?
God, I don't know.
You see what I mean? That's not. It's a rhetorical question, Michael. It's not about whether or not this thing is good, this thing is bad, these people are good, these people are bad. It's about representation and there being such an extreme lack of it for trans and like non-gender conforming people. You know what I mean? And that just sucks. I'm not even saying like anybody's guilty of anything. It just sucks. It fucking sucks really hard. Cuz like especially like you get it from every fucking angle when you're like non-gender conforming or you're trans. Like you get it from the patriarchy, you get it from the fucking white feminist not white feminists, I mean white feminism viewpoint like TERFs and shit, right? Like you get it from everybody. Does that make sense? Like you just get fucking pounded in the paint from like every fucking viewpoint. And that just fucking sucks. It's just fucking terrible. And I don't know. I hate to belabor the point, but fucking Jesus Christ. Is it just so fucking tiring to exist? Does that make sense, Michael?
Yeah.
Like, I do emotional labor by existing. And that's like bullshit. I shouldn't have to do that.
Nope.
Like, sorry?
Yeah, no, you shouldn't.
I don't know, Mike. I feel like I'm putting you in a bind here.
I don't know, like, I don't know.
I feel like my rhetoric is forcing you to either say something wrong or say something confrontational.
Mm, No,
in
it's
order
just
to
more like
comment on it. Yeah, I'm not trying to put you in a position. I'm just like I'm hoping I'm explaining well to my audience like the experience of like, oh yeah, am I calling me? Whatever, my phone can ring. Yeah, I was actually gonna do this later, but surprise, I'm trans. I guess no one on the podcast knew that.
so I guess you're not cutting this.
No, I'm not gonna cut this. Well, like this conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been making constant reference to the audience. I might just make this the whole episode, honestly. I don't know, Michael. I really want your input.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that like clearly you would at least from what I've been getting, it's I don't know. I think changing getting people to act against their own self-interests and changing minds is difficult if not impossible. And so it can feel like you're punching a brick wall at times, but
Yeah, the amount of like double thinking, like you think one. I don't want to use terms like that without like fully understanding them because I'll be honest, I don't super understand double think because I think it's a fucking stupid like phrase. Not even because like the idea is dumb, but like I think it's a dumb phrase. Like I was with my grandma and like she's like queer to some degree, but she had to like suppress it, right? And like I'm the only person in our family who knows, I believe, right? So like hearing her talking to her, and she grew up in like I think she was born in like the late 30s or something. Like she grew up as a beneficiary of leftist principles, right? Like
mhm.
just as a nature of when she was born, she benefited from like a lot of leftist movements in the US coming to like
Yes, our most socialist period.
yes, she literally is benefiting from that. And then I was hearing her like I was and it sucks too cuz like we were having like a really good conversation and I was like, "Damn, my grandma really supports me, right?" And I'm like, "That's awesome. That's good for me. I'm lucky." And then we're having a conversation over lunch and it's like, "Okay." And she's like, "Yeah, well, public," and she was a social worker by the way. Like she would like buy groceries for people who like couldn't get their food stamps in time because of like bureaucracy or and shit like that, right? And then she says shit like, "Oh yeah, like socialist healthcare doesn't work." And all this stuff and like she was part of like the board that like looked into socializing medicine like way back in the day for our state and stuff like that. And then she's like, "Yeah, it just doesn't work." And I'm like, "Well, grandma, like you don't." I don't want to say she didn't understand because she has. I disagree with her like politically because she's. I'm gonna get to it. So basically, she's saying that like, "Oh yeah, it doesn't work," and I was like, "Well, grandma," and she's like, "You need." She was like, "Well, blah 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 blah," and she basically said like, "Oh, socialized medicine will never work or just doesn't work and stuff." Like, look at the NHS, and I was like, "Well, the NHS is like that because of extreme like lack of funding and like burnout amongst the staff and how it's being constantly rallied against by people in the UK who want to privatize it." But I didn't get to get all that out. And she was basically saying like, "Well, you think you know better than people." And she wasn't like accusing me. She was just basically saying like, "You need to humble yourself and like understand that other people have like looked into this stuff." And I was like, "Well, I've done the research." And then she was basically like, "Well, it doesn't matter if you've done the research, blah blah blah." And that was like really frustrating to hear, right? And I was like, "Grandma, like somebody I know works in the NHS. Like I literally know somebody who works in the NHS." You know what I mean? Like I have never been like so thoroughly talked over and like my opinions have never been like so thoroughly and my opinions that I believe are right factually. I've never been like so thoroughly dismissed by somebody who like I thought like wanted the same things I would want. Does that make sense? And this is what I'm talking about, like double think. Like, oh, she thinks people deserve help and stuff. But she also thinks that like socialism means that she has to give away everything she's ever earned to somebody who doesn't deserve it. Right? And then like later she called me, and I don't bring politics up. I'll clap back against people usually. But I usually don't bring politics up unless somebody else brings up something that like is important for me to say my bit about. I don't bring politics up because it's just not worth it with my family because they're conservative, right? At least to some decent degree. Like for example, my dad, like without saying the word union, I basically like told him like, yeah, unions are awesome. Or like I was explaining how like the workers should own everything and like how the dispatch people and the workers do more than the executives. And my dad was talking about like how the people who told him what to do didn't know what the fuck he actually needed to do and shit like that. And I was like, yeah. But then I brought up unions, like, no, unions are a fucking waste of time. And I'm like, oh, you're all victims of propaganda, right? And then like my grandma called me like the day after we finished eating, and she said like, huh, well, it seems that we're never going to agree on politics or whatever. Let's not bring up any of that mess. Haha. And I'm like, well, I didn't say that. I was just like, yeah. But in my mind, I was thinking, wow, well, never bring that up, huh? Yeah. I mean, I guess I could just die. That'd be cool. Um, like, I could just get legislated out of existence because, like, healthcare really matters to me as, like, a trans person more than, like, it would to the normal, healthy, non-disabled, like, cis person. And it's really rough, like, existing in a world where even your staunchest allies can't be trusted to want what's best for you or even listen to you when you're telling them actively what's best for you. You know what I mean? And I don't it's really hard to like explain that to other people. That's why I just use that story about my grandma. Like in the same car ride that like that all happened, or the same thing where that all happened, she was talking to me about like her queer experience, and I was like, "Grandma, how do you not understand like what the problem is here?" You know, and it's really rough. As I'm talking about, like just existing is so hard, especially around people who just don't understand. You know what I mean, Mike?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It feels like being betrayed. Like when you think people are gonna like keep your safety in the utmost and like work towards your benefit, and they say those things, right? And they want to do stuff for you, but they're unwilling to reframe their frame of mind into one that justifies your existence. It hurts something fierce. It's really hard to describe like how badly that fucked me up. Honestly, now it's still kind of fucking me up. It just that kind of like ruined my whole like week when I heard that. Cuz like it really took me out of like the happy place that I had reached with my grandma. All I'm saying, I guess, is like to the viewers, like if you want to be an ally, you have to understand that your allyship is appreciated and welcome and necessary. But also that like you should never be under the impression that you are capable of dictating anything about issues that like the people you're allying with have. Like if you have trans and non-binary like friends, family, whatever, colleagues, like comrades, like don't ever presume that you know what's better for them. If that makes any sense. Like you don't get to dictate that. Because all you'll end up doing is hurting them and like throwing the discourse back. Honestly, that's all I really have to say. I'll probably like edit this, but I'm not even sure it's gonna be up today on it was Monday the 6th. I don't
Yep.
know. It's gonna be kind of hard listening to this again. You got any outro in you, Mike?
Um. Oh boy. Well, I guess if there's anything that we can remember and look fondly at in history on this June 6th of the year of our Lord 2020, uh, two. Uh, that fascism bad. Storm the beaches of fascism.
Oh yeah, Operation Overlord.
Yeah.
I almost forgot. Yeah, you brought that up right before we started recording. Yeah. Well, fuck the fascists. Fuck everybody else who doesn't believe in the struggle, and generally just like go live your life and be happy. And that'll be it for me today. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.